Welcome to Human Anatomy. So, hi everyone. To start out with, I did send everyone an email with some information, and just to point out a couple of things here before we even get started. My lectures are out of this current 9th edition of our textbook, Human Anatomy by Martini. But as I mentioned, if you get an older edition, like the 8th edition, that works fine. And if you decide to buy one, that obviously saves you quite a bit of money. My lectures are out of the current 9th edition. Figures and such that I use out of our textbook are out of this current one, but then the older one is fine. It's adequate. All right? So let me introduce myself. I'm Mr. Joe Cermeño, Mr. Z. Easy to remember, easy to pronounce, and definitely easy to spell. And I'll do my best to learn your names as soon as I can. But let's do a little exercise here. I like to do this with my class. Let's read this out together. This class is going to kick my ass. So it will in a particular way. I don't mean to be intimidating. I don't want this to scare you. I want this to kind of wake you up in the sense that you guys are starting your allied health careers with anatomy. Physiology is probably the next class you're taking. But, you're going to be doing a lot of work in this class and in your subsequent classes. So the analogy is, let's consider like going to the gym to work out. You have a really strong, vigorous, successful workout. And you're exhausted afterwards and you say, wow, that really kicked my ass. So in that sense, we're going to do a lot of work in this class to prepare you for success, not just in this class, but in your future classes and in your allied health careers, whatever you decide to be. And after this class, I want you to say, wow, that was a lot of work. That kind of kicked my butt, but in a very good way, and it's prepared you for success in the future. So that's my job, right? I want you to do well. So just like a little puppy dog here, after our class is done, and hopefully you've done really well, and you're ready for your next classes, it's like the little doggy here, boom, right here, bam. After the class is over, boom, you're free to enjoy yourself, take a break, have some fun. If you can afford it, go to a nice little island, go to a lake, go to a river, and take a break, relax, enjoy a nice, successful class, and then take a plunge and enjoy yourself. Not that you shouldn't enjoy yourself now, but let's look to a nice, successful semester together and a nice reward at the end. So, to prepare for success, a couple things. Read your textbook and lab manual before you do any work associated with lecture and the lab. The best thing you can do before you watch my lectures, before you come to class, before you do any lab activities, read the textbook fully and read the lab manual. All right? Now you'll find out that as I do my lectures, I don't cover every single thing in the textbook, but if you read everything in the textbook, that sets you up to do better in the class versus if you read the textbook after lecture, or if you, for some reason, decide not to read the textbook. That's not setting you up for success. Okay? Attend lecture and lab, whether it's face-to-face or online, right? Don't skip class. That kills students. And then study every day. Every day. Schedule some time to sit yourself in some nice, calm, hopefully quiet place so that you can study. Have it be your routine. Don't wait for the weekend. That's usually too little, too late. Okay? And then use the class resources for our class. Study guides I provide you, supplemental materials, whether they're lab supplements, whether they're supplemental videos, whatever I provide for you are things that I've designed to make you be successful, to prepare you for success in my class, in our class. And then also me. If you have any problems, any issues, something is not clear, you feel lost, contact me as soon as possible so we can deal with the issue and have you move forward in the class and have a nice successful outcome at the end of the semester. Okay? I want you to succeed. That's my job. Your job is put in the work. Okay, so let's get into the work. So, Chapter 1, Intro to Anatomy. So what is anatomy? The study of the structures and relationships between the parts, the pieces, and the body. Right? So here's the heart. It has a particular shape, particular structures that we can talk about and learn. Same thing with the rib cage or the skull, or if you're looking at tissues, like nervous tissue slide here, we can talk about these cells, right? What they look like. Now, the structure of things is related to how they operate, how they function. That's physiology. That's probably the next class you'll take. This is the study of the function of these bodily structures. So if we look at the heart, it has 4 chambers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 atria, 2 ventricles. We can talk about their shapes and where they're positioned next to each other. But the physiology is dealing with how and why they contract the atria to propel blood down into these things called ventricles, and then how they contract and pump blood out through these blood vessels, right? The aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So how the structures work is the physiology. The shape and the morphology and the position of the structures, that's the anatomy. And these are obviously linked to each other. The physiological functions are done by anatomical structures. That's why the heart is shaped the way it is, because it has a certain function to do. And when we go through the class, we spend a lot of time on anatomy, but we also spend some time on physiology. Okay, so let's talk about microscopic anatomy. So these are structures that are small, so they need magnification, like with a microscope. Okay, so cytology is a field of study that's involved with looking at the internal cell structures, like the biology of the cell. And we'll spend some time on that, but we'll spend more time on looking at the study of tissues. So this is a slide of nervous tissue, and that's histology, right? Study of tissues. We'll look at neurons and supporting cells. These little dark spots are actually the nuclei of supporting cells. We can't see much of the cell, just the nucleus of each one. And notice that the nucleus here of the larger neuron is larger. And we'll talk about what these other type of cells do in nervous tissue. So if we look at this slide, it's like, whoa, this is a bit more complex because this is actually a histological slide of 2 types of tissue, an underlying connective tissue and an overlying epithelial tissue. Right? This is actually a section of the small intestine. And when we get to tissues and the histology of tissues, pretty soon, students are sometimes overwhelmed because they'll look at something like this and they'll say, I have no idea what I'm looking at. But we'll get through it and we'll look at it structure by structure, cell type in the tissues, and it won't take too long before you'll be able to decipher what you see histologically. Okay, so I was talking about tissues there. So what's a tissue? Group of specialized cells that perform a specialized specific function. So in the human body, we've got 4 tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous or neural tissue. You can see the figure here is from chapter 3. So in chapter 3 is when we really spend a lot of time on tissues. But briefly here, epithelial tissue is a covering type of tissue. So the surface of your skin is all epithelial tissue. But also notice that its lining internal passageway and chambers, like the heart chambers, are lined by epithelial tissue. Your mouth is lined by epithelial tissue. If you were to swallow, say, a marble, and it goes through your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines, etc., that marble will be in contact with epithelial tissue that's lining your internal digestive tract. Okay? And more information here as we get into chapter 3. Connective tissue. Bones, ligaments, tendons that connect to each other are types of connective tissue. Your blood is a fluid, unique fluid, liquid connective tissue. Our fat that we store, where's my cursor? Here we go. That's a type of connective tissue. And we'll cover that in detail when we get into chapter 3. There's a lot of variety here in connective tissue. Muscle tissue is more straightforward, right? Your skeletal, cardiac, or smooth muscle tissue has a unique characteristic where the cells in the tissue can contract, shorten to produce movement. Right? We'll talk about that when we get into muscles. And then nervous tissue, unique cells, neurons, that produce and generate an electric current, nerve impulse, or an action potential, and that's used to control and communicate throughout the entire body. If you're going to move your skeletal muscles, like to take a sip of coffee or tea, the neurons in the nervous tissue send those action potential nerve impulse signals to the muscle cells and muscle tissue to allow that type of movement. And again, we'll cover these in detail when we get to them in subsequent chapters. So let's talk about gross anatomy. Not like icky gross, but structures that are large enough to see with the naked eye. So surface anatomy, the shape morphology of superficial markings. So here in the anterior view of the neck, for example, here we can kind of see this V-neck structure. That's a surface morphological feature of the neck, and that's because underlying the skin here, there's a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid. Okay? You can see it on the surface. Notice this forearm and this forearm. This is out of whack, right? That's a abnormal morphological surface anatomy of the forearm because this individual, this child, broke those two bones in there, the radius and the ulna. Okay, now they've been aligned properly, and then you put a cast on that to isolate the bones so that they can heal properly. Okay, but a little bit on surface anatomy there. Let's talk about regional anatomy. So this is superficial and internal features of a region, like the neck region again here, the cervical area. If you remove the skin and the underlying fat, here the cadavers, the head's kind of moved off to looking towards its right. So that would be the cheek area there. But there's that sternocleidomastoid muscle I was talking about that gives that kind of V-neck surface marking on the anterior portion of the neck. Okay, so regional anatomy, the anatomy of a region. Systemic anatomy, the anatomy of a system. So if we talk about, say, the digestive system again, or the respiratory system here, systemic anatomy, so the anatomy of the nasal cavity, the esophagus for a little bit, the trachea or the windpipe, right? The anatomy of the lungs, the muscles that allow us to breathe, like the diaphragm. That's systemic anatomy of the respiratory system. And we'll talk about that when we get into systems later on. We can talk about developmental anatomy, changes occurring between conception and maturity in the human body, right? Embryology is a subset of that, changes within the first 2 months of development, which are really important. Or comparative anatomy, comparing different species of animals. Sometimes we'll do this in a lab when we don't have access to a human cadaver, for example. Here we're looking at the anterior front view of the shoulder and the right chest area and the right upper arm of a human. Right? If we don't have a human cadaver to explore these muscles and or joints, we can use something like a cat. Here's the same area in a cat, except that the forearm is moved upwards, so there's the elbow joint in the cat. But a lot of the musculature is the same, some differences, but using a cat for comparative studies with the human is very useful, especially if you don't have access to a human cadaver. Okay? Let's talk about surgical anatomy. See, these are the study or the area of looking at anatomical landmarks for surgical procedures. So surgeons will use anatomical landmarks, surface landmarks, to know where to do a cut, an incision, for example, so that they can get to what they're looking for deep in the body and to minimize scarring. There's radiographic anatomy. So some of you guys are going to be x-ray techs or ultrasound techs, etc. So these are ways of imaging the body, like sonography here, to look at what you want to look at, right? Or CAT scans or MRI scans, those sorts of things. Different types of radiographic anatomy. So here's a little bit on surgical anatomy. You don't need to know the details here, but you do need to know what I have in the text portion, okay? My little bullet points, that's for sure. So we'll continue this